Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Quite possibly the most important political philosopher of all times and places, the most important political philosopher of this course, arguably. Everything in philosophy is controversial, but Hegel occupies a very special place. Jürgen Habermas, whom we'll talk about later in the course, talks about how Hegel, in many ways, defines the fairway of political discussions for the 20th and I would say for the 21st century. Now, Hegel is a very challenging philosopher to talk about. With the exception of Kant, every philosopher we have spoken about before, writes more or less for the general public. More or less. And I would say that the basic insights of every philosopher we talked about, including Kant, can be explained in simple terms. Now, Hegel is a university professor. Because Hegel is a university professor, his style is far more complex. Moreover, Hegel, as far as we can tell biographically, was not really interested in, explaining simple ideas over and over again in the simplest language. No, Hegel was, was always writing at the cutting edge of his own understanding. He was interested in pushing his own thought forward. So, again, Hegel is complicated because he's a university professor, but also because he didn't take time to go back and rewrite, his own philosophy in simpler terms. He has left this task to his followers, by and large. Now, also, I could mention that Hegel, of course, is writing from a context of German classical idealism, which most students are not really familiar with, so this is an additional complication. But even more so, and this is an important point which we'll have an occasion to return back to, Hegel is writing in a regime of very strict censorship. Some of Hegel's colleagues basically went to prison for their philosophical, academic views. So, arguably, Hegel, sometimes he's writing for you and me, for the prospective readers, and some things that he wrote, he probably had Prussian censors in mind. So this is kind of an additional level of complexity. However, so there's depth to Hegel. In many ways, Hegel is profound. He's profound in a way that most philosophers we talked about before, I think, are not profound, right? With possible exception of maybe Plato. Right? But in Hegel, there's real depth. And, the kind of insights that you get, second, third, fifth, 10th year that you study Hegel, is hard to compare. I understand this is controversial, but Hegel is not John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is writing for newspapers, okay? On liberty and utilitarianism, general public to read, not Hegel. Anyway, however, I do believe very strongly that it should be possible to explain Hegel in simple terms. So let me try my best to give a rundown of Hegel, the simplest, most superficial reading of Hegel, in 2 minutes. Hegel in 2 minutes. So, actually, Hegel in 3 words is this. Freedom has conditions. Freedom has conditions. This is a course in political philosophy, so we're talking about political freedom, first and foremost. Political freedom of citizens requires particular conditions, more specifically social conditions, and these social conditions have to develop historically. So if you want social historical conditions. And in general, Hegel is hard to interpret, so take it with a grain of salt. In my own perspective, the best way to understand Hegel is as a conservative, reformist, but cautious reformist, communitarian liberal. Now these words all should be taken with great care, because Hegel, by and large, doesn't use any of them. And certainly Hegel did not call himself a communitarian. But, I would say that tentatively with a question mark, I think it's a good starting position. Now, communitarian here precisely refers to this idea that freedom has social conditions, that freedom is possible only in a well-ordered society, And a well-ordered society has to emerge through the historical process. So we have talked about this when we talked about Rousseau, right? This idea of the miracle of the lawgiver. In place of the miracle of the lawgiver, Hegel and later down the line Marx are going to talk about the historical process. Now, characterizing Hegel as a liberal, of course, is another deeply controversial move. But and I'll have something to say about this in the rest of this lecture. But I insist that reading Hegel as a fascist is a gross misunderstanding of his philosophy. And very often, philosophers like Karl Popper or Bertrand Russell have this characterization of Hegel basically as a fascist. And I feel on the part of Popper and on the part of Russell, it's just lack of understanding. Are they to blame for this? Well, no, not necessarily, because Hegel is hard to understand. But, it's misunderstanding nonetheless. So when I say that Hegel is liberal, what I mean is that definitely a deep and profound value to which Hegel is committed is the well-being and freedom, let's say objective well-being and subjective freedom of the individual citizen. So a good society, in a well-ordered society, the individuals are happy and free, self-realized, and individuals go along with the public order freely. It's a very important element of subjective freedom embedded in Hegel. So subjective individual freedom, subjective individual freedom. And in this sense, Hegel is very much a liberal. So much so that, again, last time we've been discussing utilitarianism. Of course, one should not call Hegel a utilitarian. But you see, again, Mill says that the purpose of the state is the happiness of the citizens. Now, I think Hegel might add something to this picture, but Hegel would say that a good state necessarily takes care of its citizens. In a good state, citizens are happy. And if you want, yes, I'm prepared to defend this position. There's at least a utilitarian element in Hegel's philosophy. So this is, again, jumping ahead to the conclusions, this is the kind of picture of Hegel that I'm going to be drawing. Now, let me maybe set the context a little bit. So, in many, again, I've spoken last time of Mill, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. Mill, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. I feel that this constellation of these four philosophers, in many ways, is the most important constellation for us today in the 21st century. So, speaking more precisely about Hegel, well, actually about all four, we are dealing with the question of modernity. Different ways in which we can describe what modernity means. When does modernity begin exactly? But the word modernity is usually associated with the idea of the Enlightenment. Again, this rational self-understanding and self-transparency of human individuals and also of human societies. Again, the simplest formulation of the project of enlightenment, I would say, is again this notion that through reason we can understand human nature, we can understand the laws of society, and we can reshape society in a harmonious fashion. And in fact, there's going to be a very productive picture, which I think is, broadly speaking, has echoes in Mill and Hegel, even in Nietzsche and definitely in Marx, is this notion that humanity basically goes through three stages. Well, this is most immediately associated with Hegel. The first stage is the stage of innocence, child or animal-like innocence. Hegel sometimes, technical jargon, uses the phrase undifferentiated unity. So when I say undifferentiated unity, it's something like a simple harmony of the individual with their environment. So it's harmony, but it's simple child-animal-like harmony in a sense, right? Then, and you could imagine this in terms of, hunter-gatherers, or maybe the ancient Greek polis, it depends on your philosophy of history. Then, as society matures, becomes more complex, we go through a period of conflict. And the two paradigmatic examples of this conflict are going to be the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Both of these have this huge promise, French Revolution, the promise of liberalism, of democracy, of political representation, of accountability of the government. But the French Revolution immediately, well, the legacy of the French Revolution is extraordinarily complex. To this day, people debate whether the French Revolution was successful or not. But immediately, obviously, the French Revolution devolves into the Reign of Terror, the guillotine, basically. And the French Revolution ends ultimately with the restoration of monarchy, especially with Napoleon. So the French Revolution, in a very important respect, at least in the short term, fails to achieve its goals. So the second stage is the stage of conflict. And the Industrial Revolution, in a very similar fashion, Industrial Revolution holds this great promise of prosperity. So this is like political harmony and representation and accountability. And this is material prosperity. So, technocracy, through understanding the laws of nature, humans come to master nature, master necessity, conquer diseases, right? The promise of the Industrial Revolution. But in a similar fashion, the immediate consequence of the Industrial Revolution is huge immiseration of workers. Again, Adam Smith, anticipating the Industrial Revolution, talks about the universal opulence, wealth for all, but the immediate outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution is rich get richer, poor get poorer. Again, as a matter of historical fact, dirt poor workers dying in industrial Manchester from lack of sunlight, right? This is the kind of misery that we're talking about. So deeply, again, like the promise of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, and the reality that this promise is not delivered. So the second stage is conflict, and this would be differentiated disunity. So this is, the first stage is simple harmony. The second stage is we have the emergence of complexity, but complexity brings with it conflict. So complexity, individuality. So in an important sense, remember conflict, consensus. This would be the consensual stage, but it's a simple consensus because humans are not yet individuals, if you want. This, on the second stage, human individuality, human individual subjectivity emerges. So, very bold historical and philosophical claim, which there's not enough time to substantiate, but the strong assertion is that human beings are not born subjects or individuals. Human beings become subjects or individuals throughout the historical process, especially starting with the French and the Industrial Revolution. Other events play an important role. And then, on the third stage, and this one in brackets and with a question mark, we're talking about the overcoming of this conflict and an emergence of, or an attainment of complicated harmony. So in a sense, conflict, and this would be genuine, complex, conscious consensus, but true consensus. And this would be differentiated unity. So this would be complex harmony, something that, for example, Emil Durkheim will call organic solidarity. All sorts of words. Ferdinand Tönnies, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. The simple Gemeinschaft and the conflictual Gesellschaft, and then the attempt to reestablish harmony at a higher level. And in many ways, talking about Hegel, people always, often introduce all sorts of jargon, talk about, for example, dialectics and historicism. This is, in the simplest formulation, this is the vision of Hegelian dialectic. Words which Hegel doesn't really use about thesis and antithesis. The thesis of the simple harmony, then the antithesis of this conflictual element, and then the emergence of the consensus on the higher level. A simple human consciousness without self-consciousness, a complicated self-conscious individuality which leads to conflict, like the stage of adolescence, and then the stage of conservative maturity is when you overcome the conflicts and you achieve unity and harmony, achieve true consensus on a higher stage. Now, and this third stage is going to be what Hegel talks about as the end of history, the solution to the riddle of history. Like throughout the historical development, we had this problem. In many ways, the simplest way to summarize this issue is the conflict between the interests of the individual and the interests of the community. On this first stage, community subsumes the individual, subjects the individual. There's no individuality. Community wins, and that's why there's no conflict. Here, individuality emerges, but it leads to conflict. But here, individuality and community are reconciled. We have spoken about this so many times before. Rousseau's general will. Humans are rational, laws are rational, individuals freely and rationally choose to obey free, rational laws. There is no difference on this stage between freedom and obedience. This will be free obedience. But true reconciliation, true harmony of interest. Again, so the end of history, this rational constitutional state, which is based on meritocratic civil service elite, meritocratic technocratic civil service elite who are accountable to, so again, people, expert cabinet like in Mill, but who are accountable to the elective representative assembly, right? So, and when Habermas talks about us as being Hegelians, isn't this still, in the 21st century, isn't this still our ideal? Kind of this rational constitutional state. Again, this notion that this is the solution to the riddle of history. Whatever other challenge arises before us, climate change, meteor strikes, global pandemics, we know how to solve them. We appoint experts on the basis of exams, and these experts are supervised by an elective body, which represents the entire population, right? Isn't this still our goal? And I suppose the last thing I want to say by way of this introduction is that this is the promise, and this is also the challenge of Hegelian philosophy. Hegel draws this wonderful picture. It is very much a normative ideal, a vision of this perfect society and the end of history. And the question is, are we there yet? Have we achieved this end of history? And this, you might have heard, very famous distinction between left Hegelians and right Hegelians. The right Hegelians, the conservative, maybe even fascist right Hegelians, are going to say, yes, we have already achieved the end of history. We already live in a perfect society. And if you don't like it, the problem was with you. Society is already perfect. It's a right Hegelian reading of Hegel. Conservative, sometimes Christian, sometimes religious. Francis Fukuyama talks about this in terms of American-style liberal democracy as the end of history. And then there's the left Hegelian reception of Hegel. Of course, most importantly exemplified in the figure of Karl Marx, whom we'll talk about next time. Marx is going to say the ideal is right, and by and large, with some nuances, this is going to be the vision of communism for Marx as well. So today we talk about Hegel, but we also lay the groundwork for Marx next time. The vision of this harmonious society at the end of history. But Marx is going to say, we are not there yet. We need a revolutionary transformation in order to get there. It is a wonderful picture, but today it exists not as reality, but only as an ideology which masks the potentiality for the future. So that's the story. I hope you're intrigued. In the next section, let's go to work explaining this picture. So, quite possibly, the most important concept of Hegel's philosophy as a whole is the notion of freedom. Now, this has different connotations, metaphysical connotations, theological connotations. But let's try to explain this in simpler terms. Now, when we compare Hegel to Mill, I think it's quite clear. Mill, again, as a determinist, Mill would say that freedom can only be an instrumental value. We want to be free because we want to be happy. And it is impossible to be reliably happy without being free. Now, for Hegel, I think that there's a certain intimation that freedom is a value in its own right. However, this is going to be a huge difference between, let's say, Hegel and Kant, or Hegel and Augustine. For Kant and Augustine, to do the right thing mostly or very often entails repressing, restraining our sinful nature. Again, Kant calls human nature crooked wood. Think back to Protagoras. Straightening of warped wood, right? Krummerem Holze in German. And so much so that Schiller has an epigram against Kant, where Schiller says that the only reliable way for Kant to know that you are moral is to hate all of your friends with a passion, so that when you do good things to them, you're 100% sure that you are doing this not out of any kind of subjective inclination, but you're doing this only out of objective duty. I feel a deep indictment of Kantian philosophy by Schiller there. Now, as opposed to Kant and Augustine, there's a deep Aristotelian element in Hegel. In Hegel, yes, maybe there's value in freedom in and of itself, but realizing freedom, realizing morality does not go against our nature, it fulfills our nature. Again, think back to Aristotle. You do what is right, and you also enjoy doing what is right. The unity of the subjective and the objective inclination. So there is a very important utilitarian element in Hegel, so much so that I would say that most of the time, with few exceptions, Hegel is not opposed to utilitarian conclusions. You do what you like. You know, you do your job properly, and you are rewarded, maybe even with money, in what Hegel calls civil society or bourgeois society. And ultimately, the freedom is the unity of subjective inclination and objective duty. Unity or harmony between the two. Now, in many ways, maybe this is the most important idea. And we need to explain how this is possible. And again, I remind you that this is sort of a normative ideal which emerges through history as a potentiality. Are we there yet? It's a separate question. So Hegel is drawing an idealized model. Are the states in which you, my dear listener, find yourself, is your state already harmonious state at the end of history? We're not sure, okay? It's a complicated question, difficult, sometimes dangerous question to ask, right? But we are trying to understand the idealized model. So within this idealized model, let me draw a picture. So we begin with what Hegel calls the moment of pure indeterminacy. Pure indeterminacy. So this is a very important negative element at the basis, at the root of individual freedom. So I wake up in the morning. What can I do? What should I do? Whatever. My choice is not bounded by anything. Let's remember David Hume, the is-ought problem. Maybe I even have certain passions, but does it follow from the fact that I have certain passions that I should gratify those passions? No, not really, not exactly. Nietzsche is going to make much of this notion, right? Potential problem with Mill's philosophy, again. Small v values, but not capital V justification of morality, our passions, I mean. So, and at the stage of pure indeterminacy, maybe this is from minus infinity to plus infinity. I can do absolutely whatever. But because I can do absolutely whatever, and no reason is binding, the fact of a particular desire is not binding, a given argument in my head is not binding, I do not do anything. So this is maximum extent of freedom. So if you want, this is abstract freedom. And abstract for Hegel likes the word abstract. It means defective, one-sided, partial. So this is freedom in the abstract, right? So in the abstract, I am free, but in reality, I don't do anything. I have no reason to prefer one course of action over another. And now this is an abstraction, so it doesn't actually exist in reality, but this kind of an abstract individual would probably just suffocate because they would not even have the reason to take a breath of air. Now, so crucial next step. In order to actualize freedom, we need to limit it. The actualization of freedom, bringing freedom into reality, involves a limitation. Limitation or determination does not limit it limits your freedom, but it doesn't effectively limit your freedom. It enables your freedom. Restriction enables your freedom. Remember Rousseau, true freedom is obedience to the law that you have prescribed to yourself. So let's limit this endless space of possibility. And this second step now refers to this level of subjective inclination. So this is not pure indeterminacy, this is subjective determination. Now, on the level of subjective determination, Hegel talks about the German word Moralität. So he calls this morality. using the word morality in a technical sense, technical special sense. And again, this refers to kind of my own subjective inclination. And when Hegel talks about this level, he imagines that philosophers such as Rousseau and Kant are stuck on this level. And very importantly, Hegel believes that if you're only stuck on this level, you cannot create a society, a functioning society, a harmonious society. So basically, this is the criticism of the social contract tradition in Hegel, or criticism of negative freedom. Negative individual subjective freedom cannot reliably stabilize the social bond. Individuals left to their own devices, left to their own head, will not reliably make decisions that lead to good outcomes. So ultimately, like in a very straightforward sense, liberal society, purely liberal society, society based on negative freedom, will destroy itself through civil war, through war of all against all. And for those of you who think this is abstract consideration, think of the failed states. Today, right now, as of recording of this lecture, some states have effectively collapsed into a state of civil war, right? What would Locke say about this? In many ways, Hegel is anti-Locke. Locke, for Hegel, is this daydreamer who imagines that society is natural. No, society is artificial, and human beings, by their own individual reason, cannot reliably produce good social conditions. So we need to limit this even further. So on the third stage, so notice we are limiting the scope of freedom, but freedom actually becomes more and more actual. So again, on the first stage of pure indeterminacy, I don't do anything. On the second stage, I do certain things, but the things that I do, the decisions that I make, lead to the destruction of society and to the collapse of my life. Because human beings, say hi to Aristotle, are social creatures, social animals, right? We can only thrive, we can only be properly human and properly happy in a well-functioning society. And the second stage on its own does not lead to a well-functioning society. So we need to further limit this scope to achieve the true level of the general will. And famously, Hegel believes that Rousseau has tried to pose the question of the general will, but it was not able to resolve it. And this third stage, Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, or ethical life. Now, of course, let's say in the English language, the word ethics and the word morality are synonymous, so Hegel is using these terms in his own special technical way. So this is Moralität in German, this is Sittlichkeit in German. And what this refers to, it refers to the customs, norms, laws, traditions of actually existing societies. Very importantly, these customs, laws, norms, and traditions are products of history. So these are, again, let me just write the word custom, of actually existing societies, which are the products of history. So this is where Hegel solves the riddle of the miracle of the lawgiver. It's not a miracle, it's a historical process. And notice, in a very important sense, chaos, war, civil war, and wars between states, again, this slaughter bench of history that Hegel talks about. This is where it becomes effective. Again, war plays an important positive role. Societies which have bad institutions are conquered or destroy themselves from within themselves, right? So only with the benefit of historical hindsight, only with the benefit of historical experience can you know what actually works. In some sense, this is Hegel is writing before Darwin, but this is like a quasi-Darwinian explanation. Again, this notion that society is far too complex for individuals to just devise good laws. It's impossible to predict for an individual human. And by the way, in 2021, right, in the 21st century, it still seems to be far too difficult for an individual human intellect to predict the outcome of any particular legislation. So what you need is a mechanism of quasi-Darwinian natural selection, where bad states with bad laws fall by the wayside and are conquered, and the good states are retained. So when I wake up in the morning, I ask myself, what should I do? The pure indeterminacy of my will does not give me an answer. My subjective morality, my subjective reason, if I am being honest with myself, will tell me, look, Alex, your reason is insufficient. Your reason will tell you will disclose its own insufficiency. It's like the processing apparatus in your brain will say, I do not have enough processing power to tell you, Alex, what you should do when you wake up in the morning. So you have to make recourse to the laws and customs of actually existing societies. You have to ask your society what you should do. Now, the question is, how can you trust? Why can you trust the laws of your society? And the answer is because you know that your society is a product of history. The institutions of your society, however imperfect they are, have been able to stand the test of time. Again, this is conservatism, very much. This is the definition of conservatism. Conservatism, which is akin to conservatism of David Hume and conservatism of Edmund Burke, that institutions develop gradually and organically, and humans are habitual beings, and so the force of habit is important, right? However, I should also make this note, right? There's a difference between ancient times and modern times. So, just taken in the abstract, this third stage of the ethical life, Hegel likes this quote from Plutarch very much. So Plutarch recounts the story. A father asks a philosopher, I want my son to become an excellent individual, an excellent human being. What should I do? And the philosopher, in the words of Plutarch, replies, make him a citizen of a state with good laws. Make him a citizen of the state with good laws. So in many ways, again, a summary, in one sense, of Hegel's entire philosophy. But, properly speaking, again, you have this complicated, chaotic, dialectical, if you want to use this phrase, messy history, right? So it is only at the end of history where societies emerge, not just with institutions or customs which are good enough, but we ultimately solve the riddle of history. And so even though I would imagine that even in the end of history, individuals still cannot produce the vision of perfect society from within their own head, but the individual reason can verify the rationality of the institutions with which we find ourselves. So again, it's a unity of the subjective condition and the subjective inclination and the objective duty. So I wake up in the morning and I ask myself what I should do, and my subjective inclination is in line with what my society tells me I should do. And there is a very important, again, element of transparency and accountability in the objective duty. Transparency and accountability. So Hegel is not talking, for example, about despotism or tyranny or absolute monarchy. He's talking about a constitutional regime in which there's meritocracy, technocracy, there's examination, there's exams, there's accountability, there's transparency. Very importantly, there's elections, trial by jury, freedom of the press, but elections, representative assembly, where the representatives of the people are able to supervise the meritocratic civil service elite, right? And verify, are they doing their job properly or not? So, but notice, through limitation, freedom is the obedience to the rational law I have prescribed to myself. My freedom is not restricted at the end of the day by my membership in a well-ordered society. My freedom is realized through that. Again, so it's like these three components, these three elements, if you want, abstract personhood, I'm an abstract person, but then I'm also a moral subject. But then, very importantly, I'm an ethical member. I'm a member of ethical life. All three of these elements are important. So again, an abstract person, a person, a moral subject, a subject, but then an ethical member, a member. So all three elements are necessary for the realization of my freedom. And again, whatever other goals Hegel has, I want you to see the force of his argument. Again, this is not a fascist doctrine. It's a difference between just being forced to obey and understanding why you obey and agreeing to obey. Again, this is, for Hegel, this is the vision of the true generality of the general will. And I suppose the last thing I want to say, and to remind all of you, is again, this is a normative ideal. It's a very productive normative ideal. And some philosophers, like Nietzsche maybe, would be inclined to say, all this is fantasy and it's impossible to realize in reality. It's still useful as a model, but looking at this model, you should realize it's impossible in reality. So Nietzsche is hard to interpret. This is one way of interpreting Nietzsche. Other philosophers would say, this is a model, but it's already real. But then a third group of philosophers, whom we'll talk about next time, Karl Marx, is going to say, this is the right model. This is what communism is going to look like. But we're not there yet. We are not there yet. So I realize that our discussion so far has been quite abstract and quite general. And I do want to get to the details of Hegel's vision of the Rechtsstaat, the constitutional state. But before we get to the particular details, I want to give one other example. And this is going to be abstract as well. But it is a very fruitful abstraction. So this is the famous master-slave dialectic, or the dialectics of master and bondsman, Herrschaft und Knechtschaft in German. Now, this is an incredibly productive trope, which has been taken up by countless philosophers after Hegel. Philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, or Jean-Paul Sartre, or Alexander Kojève, or Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. So this is an enormously productive and pregnant metaphor. So this, you could say, a thought experiment. This thought experiment comes from Hegel's book, Phenomenology of Spirit, or Phenomenology of Mind. And full disclosure, at this stage of my intellectual career, I think it's probably the most important and the greatest book ever written in the, by humanity, by any human in all times and all places. So I disclose my biases, okay? So a very tall order, but I'm prepared to stand by this assertion. And this is just one chapter of this book, and I'm not going to do it justice, but let me try to explain it in some sense. So this is, I suppose the best way to understand this is to think of this as a thought experiment, and again, a highly abstract thought experiment, which doesn't really take place in any particular time or in any particular location. So the thought experiment begins by a human consciousness in the world of objects. And so a consciousness in the world of objects, like the first primary, is this biographical, is this historical? It's hard to say, it's very abstract. What this consciousness tries to do, it tries to think of itself as a subject, everything else as an object, and dominate everything else. Like bring everything else under its control. So maybe you could say, like a psychoanalytic interpretation of this would be a certain kind of impulse on the part of the child to dominate everything in their environment. Maybe akin to Nietzsche and will to power. Again, it's a very pregnant metaphor. So this is the consciousness of the master. And now let's add to this very abstract metaphor, this very abstract thought experiment, let's add another consciousness. So two consciousnesses come together. And what they do, they mutually try to dominate one another. And so what this leads to is fight to the death. And one consciousness destroys another, or maybe they both destroy each other. And that's the end of the story. However, there comes a point, and so you could imagine master as a kind of consciousness without self-consciousness. Again, simple, innocent consciousness, the undifferentiated unity of human being with itself. A is equal to A, self-identity, a simple self-identity. But then what happens is, again, this is a thought experiment, so we're just imagining. We imagine a consciousness which is afraid to die. Think of Hobbes and the fear of death. And because this consciousness is afraid to die, instead of fighting to the death, it decides to submit. And, in the struggle, it loses. The slave becomes the slave of the master and now begins to work for the master. So in an important sense, you could say the slave was the loser. But actually, in terms of this thought experiment, in terms of this historical, phenomenological, whatever, biographical development, this is a step forward. This is how human individuality, human subjectivity, but also human societies, this is how they progress. This is the source of progress. Again, Marx is going to make so much of this. Oh, so much of this. It's a very important metaphor for Marx as well. So if you want, the slave is the emergence of self-consciousness, but it's a conflictual self-consciousness. It's an unhappy consciousness. It's a consciousness which is at war with itself and is alienated. Self-consciousness. But it is alienated. Alienation, Entfremdung in German, is a very important word here. It does not feel at home in the world. It is subordinate. It is at the mercy of external circumstances. First and foremost, again, it's forced to work for the master. Sometimes Hegel talks about this as consciousness in itself, and this is the consciousness for another. So in itself, and this one is consciousness for another. Now, the way that this dialectics is a technical term. I don't want to go into the weeds. Basically, again, it means this process of conflict and reconciliation of conflict. It's a very important phrase that Hegel uses, Aufhebung, which is difficult to translate into English. Aufhebung means at the same time cancel, preserve, lift up. It's the word that would be translated as sublimation from the Latin word sublime, high, lofty. And this is exactly the word that Freud is going to use, sublimation, right? So sublimation, or Aufhebung, is an essence of dialectics in the sense that it's not just a conflict, but it's a productive conflict in which elements aren't just superseded, but reconciled, and certain productive elements on more primitive stages are retained and lifted up, Aufhebung, lifted up on later stages. So the third stage, well, I'm not sure exactly what would be the best word to use here, but as an oversimplification, you'll have to excuse me, I'm going to write the word citizen. It's kind of jumping far ahead. And the consciousness of the citizen is going to be consciousness in itself, but for another at the same time. So if you want, it's going to be like being oneself with another. Being oneself with another. Or I could write for oneself. So the master's consciousness is in itself. It's undifferentiated unity of consciousness with itself. This is differentiated disunity. The slave is alienated. And citizen is the overcoming of alienation. It is consciousness which is aware of itself. So this is conflictual. Slave is conflictual self-consciousness. This is harmonious self-consciousness. Consciousness of me with myself. Full self-consciousness. Now, again, important elements are missing from the board. So what happens is that the slave is forced to submit. But as the slave is forced to submit, the slave acquires the capacity to work for the master, but also to work on itself. Consciousness having itself as its object. So the idea of self-discipline and self-development. Self-discipline. So in this sense, the master is just slave to passion. It's not really a human being. It's a slave to passion. And again, so many analogies you can draw. One analogy is, again, a child. A young child is not a fully formed person yet. They're just a screaming bundle of desires, slave to passion. It's not real freedom. It's a Willkür, arbitrariness, arbitrary freedom, my will, I want. But it's not real freedom. Real freedom is going to be obedience to the law that one has prescribed to oneself on this third stage. But in order to get to this third stage, you need to pass through the second stage of slavery to another. Because being slave to another frees you from being a slave to your own passions. You acquire independence from your passions. Again, so this is obedience to the law, the rationally self-prescribed law. Obedience to rational, self-prescribed law, broadly speaking. Now, another important element that Hegel talks about in this picture is recognition. And you can think of recognition, you think of Hobbes, glory-seeking animals. Think of Rousseau, amour propre, it's desire for glory. And remember, for Rousseau, amour propre was a negative, deleterious emotion that led to conflict, but also more proper, was instrumental in the establishing of the true social contract for Rousseau. It is the source of honor, source of patriotism, true patriotism in a well-ordered society. So kind of in a similar fashion, master seeks recognition, but the master is not satisfied with the recognition of the slave. Recognition is only satisfactory when it is recognition by the equal. So there's a certain very important liberal, democratic, egalitarian element in this entire dialectical process. So you could talk about how children become social, but you can also talk about how feudalism is superseded by a certain kind of liberal order. When you instead of masters and serfs, instead of lords and serfs, we get the community of equal citizens. I suppose one last asterisk I want to make here is, again, this deep tradition of psychoanalytic interpretation of this picture, right? And this is an important point that we'll have to keep coming back to. Again, think of Callicles, think of Thrasymachus. Again, a child is born, yes, it's a slave to passion, but in order to become a person, in order to become social, there's an element of violence. We have to acquire self-consciousness, we have to acquire language, Sprachlichkeit, linguisticality. Master just exists, but the slave doesn't just exist. Slave exists, but also describes their existence in a certain way. And so let's put citizen in brackets and with a question mark. It's a wonderful normative ideal, but are we citizens in the 21st century? Because philosophers like Nietzsche and Foucault would say it's a nice story, but actually most of us are slaves. We're slaves to society. Again, this, thinking back to Callicles and Thrasymachus, this element of social criticism, that in fact, the process of becoming a member of society is a violent process. And, culture is about domination of individuals by society, and education and upbringing is about the subjugation, the violent repression, right? So, even Freud, of course, is going to say that Freud and Marcuse are going to talk about how repressions are necessary for individuals to become human individuals, if you want, right? And Freud, in his pessimistic fashion, talks about how the goal of psychoanalysis is not to become free, because liberation is impossible in this kind of a picture. You're either slave to passion or slave to others. But he says the task of psychoanalysis is to replace neurotic misery with ordinary human unhappiness. So again, I keep circling around the same topic. In Hegel, we see the promise, but also the challenge. The promise is that, first of all, the challenge or the threat is that this slavery to society is an inevitable element of our sociality. But then there's a hope, there's a promise that we're going to be able to overcome this slavery and achieve true harmony. And the question that we need to keep asking ourselves over and over and over again, is it possible? And again, history plays an important role. Language and thought are historical. Language is historical, and therefore thought is historical. And Locke is wrong and Kant is wrong, because they do not understand this historical linguistic determination of human thought and therefore of human nature. And again, the question is, are we already at the historical stage when we are citizens completely, to some extent? Or is it in the future, or is it impossible? Again, these are, I feel, the most important questions that we are asking in this course, and I hope that our discussion of Hegel helps you appreciate them. So finally, let's talk about the details of the political arrangement that Hegel envisions. So Hegel uses the word Rechtsstaat, which is somewhat difficult to translate into English. It means literally rights state, so constitutional state. And this is the vision of this harmonious society at the end of history. Now, structurally, the Rechtsstaat, the constitutional state, consists of three elements. And for most citizens, most individuals, this is going to be the three levels of their relationship to the state. So first of all, children are born into a family. And in many ways, when we're born into a family, this is our first experience of being a member of something that is greater than ourselves. So it's an experience of membership. And also notice that when we talk about families, of course, families are small, innocent. I mean, we are talking about a bourgeois nuclear family. We're not talking about a feudal clan, right? But still, we are talking about something which is, broadly speaking, has this connotation of undifferentiated unity, right? Of the family members. There's a certain element of this undifferentiated unity here, undifferentiated unity. Simple harmony. I mean, of course, not all families are harmonious. And of course, the idea is that when children grow up, they move on to make their own families. But there's a certain element of, again, this undifferentiated unity in the family. But then, when a child grows up, they become the member of what Hegel calls bürgerliche Gesellschaft. Now, bürgerliche Gesellschaft is often translated as civil society. And that's a valid translation, but you have to hear in the word bürgerliche Gesellschaft, a bürger is a bourgeois, somebody who lives in a city. So bürgerliche Gesellschaft is first and foremost a bourgeois association. So this word, civil society, is going to have a deeply negative connotation for both Hegel and Marx. Civil society plays an important role, but its role is limited. So the civil society, or again, in German, this bourgeois association, is the market, the war of all against all in the market. And this would be the moment of differentiated disunity. So the notion is that on its own, the negative freedom, the social contract of Locke, leads to war of all against all and destroys itself. Bourgeois society on its own will lead to its own self-destruction. However, if it is properly organized, then it can contribute. And so this I'm not sure how to write this, so there's a potentiality of war of all against all in civil society. But again, if it is inscribed in a proper constitutional framework, if it is properly regulated, then bourgeois society is wonderful and proper and highly productive. And again, for the vast majority of people, their patriotism is going to be simply doing their duty through the market, doing their job in the best possible way. So Hegel actually talks about corporations, how a well-ordered civil society, with the help of the state, is organized again through corporations. And corporations are like trade unions, and corporations are like a second, more complex kind of family. And corporations provide education, vocational training if you want. Corporations also provide a very important sense of solidarity and patriotism to the individuals, and also corporations provide welfare. So let's unpack this a little bit. So education is obvious. So kind of the idea is that if you want to become a teacher, you first become an apprentice in the corporation of teachers. Now, in terms of solidarity, it's a very important notion for Hegel, is that voting elections, representative assembly is going to be an important idea down the line. Geographical representation leads to apathy. Very often, people who live in a particular district don't have necessarily an overlapping interest with people who live near them, which very often happens. However, corporations or trade unions do have a much more robust unity of interest. So I vote for representatives in the representative assembly as a member of the corporation of teachers. So I feel myself a cell in the organ of the corporation of teachers, which is an organ in the body of the ethical community, right? And so again, an unregulated civil society leads to this kind of selfishness and pursuit, especially pursuit of wealth, pursuit of profit, so much so that, again, from the standpoint of this unregulated civil society, well, it's like tax evasion or fraud is just another maybe riskier way of earning a profit, right? And I'm reminded of Durkheim, the non-contractual elements of contract, right? So people, it's like breaking the law and paying a fine is not just an economic transaction. It's not just like how car manufacturers in the middle of the 20th century thought that seat belts are far too costly, so it's easier to pay in the course of litigation, right? To pay fines to compensate the victims of car accidents as opposed to making cars safer, right? So it's a perfectly sound economic logic of this kind of abstract homo economicus, but it's mad logic, says Hegel. If society was based on this, society would degenerate into a war of all against all. So corporations are also supposed to provide, again, this element of, again, patriotism, solidarity, of education, of vocational codex, right? That as a teacher, I'm not just, let's say, maximizing my pay, but I'm performing a very important service to the community. I'm educating the future citizens. Or the doctor isn't just trying to rip off their patients, but is interested in the health of the society at large. And this is why corporations have to be inscribed and regulated by ethical community. Now, also in addition to all this, and this is a very important issue for Hegel, and Marx is going to pick this up. Hegel says that market naturally tends to produce extremes of wealth and poverty. In fact, he says that the rich are interested in people being poor, because when people are poor, the wages are lower, and sort of people agree to do the same work for lower wages. And when you get this extremes of wealth and poverty, you get a deeply destabilizing element. So I suppose this is the most immediate way in which civil society, this bourgeois society, leads to the destruction of the ethical community. Because the extremely poor do not feel solidarity with the rest of society. Again, Locke is wrong and Kant is wrong. If you have nothing to eat, then laws of morality mean nothing to you. The extremely poor do not feel that they are taken care of by the community, and therefore they acquire what Hegel calls rebel mentality, Pöbel in German, and they no solidarity. They disrespect the law. And likewise, the extremely wealthy, the super rich, feel that they can bribe their way out of any problem, and also they disrespect the law. So you have these two classes. This is numerically massive class, and the wealthy is the politically important class. Both disrespect the law. And, war of all against all, collapse of societies, you can think of real-world examples of something like this. And this is why, again, society has to be regulated by, again, system of corporations, but also system of taxation, system of social welfare, I suppose. Especially when you talk about poverty, Hegel is a very careful reader of Adam Smith, and Hegel understands that you have structural transformations, let's say technological progress, and people lose their job through no fault of their own. The corporations then need to take care of them. There needs to be a robust system of social welfare where individuals can, let's say, acquire welfare and maybe retraining with dignity, not just a handout. Charity is no solution for Hegel. It's a difficult problem, and some philosophers like Marx are going to say that Hegel does not have a satisfactory solution. But Hegel tries his best. Provisions of social welfare state which should be administered through corporations. But all of this, ultimately, the families and the bourgeois society has to be inscribed within the general system of, again, if this is bürgerliche Gesellschaft, this is the sittliche Gemeinwesen, the system of ethical community. And where basically you have the cabinet of technocratic, meritocratic civil service elite appointed on the basis of exams. And the cabinet has to be supervised by the representative assembly elected by the people. And the representative assembly in its own turn, for Hegel, actually should be based on corporations, on corporate membership. Separate point. And kind of all of these provisions, the effective limitations, price control, taxation, subsidies, social welfare, all of this ultimately should be administered by this meritocratic civil service cabinet with the supervision of the representative assembly, so with the supervision of the population at large. So there's actually a very important word that is, Hegel uses it, but it's in the spirit of the age, Polizeiwissenschaft. Police in the broad sense of the word. Police, coming from the ancient Greek word polis, which means the city. Science of the city. How best to administer the city. So this is this, broadly speaking, police function. Welfare, taxation, subsidies, healthcare, fire departments, but also police in the narrow sense of the word. All of this would be the responsibility of a well-ordered society. So I suppose to just sort of go over this once again. So we start with the undifferentiated unity of the family. Then we go through this conflictual phase of the differentiated disunity of the civil society. But then the civil society ultimately is reconciled with the society at large through this differentiated unity, which is possible through the mediation of the political institutions, of, again, representation and the cabinet of ministers. And only then, again, Hegel is a critic of the liberal project. He's a critic of Adam Smith, but he's also a very careful reader of Adam Smith. And he wants to say that the stabilizing policies of the government will be able to bring out this deeper rationality embedded in the market process, basically the invisible hand. But the invisible hand has to be guided for Hegel. So let's talk in some more detail about the properly political organization of a Hegel state. Now, at the outset, I want to say you will notice that I think in broad outline, this is still the picture that we have today. And in an important sense, even Marx is going to retain important elements of this picture in his vision of communism. But then there are going to be some differences. And in some sense, I want to emphasize, I think, kind of the differences are less important, but I want to get everything out. So we have the people. And the majority of people are going to be members of the corporation. And again, patriotism is important. Again, patriotism, general will, unity of subjective inclination and objective duty. And the patriotism of an average person from the street is just doing their job well. And by doing their job well, they will be rewarded through the market for their job. Again, in a well-ordered society, the best way for me to earn money is to be the best teacher I possibly can. And also, in being the best possible teacher, I do my patriotic duty to my country. This is a Hegelian idea. Now, again, in terms of the political organization, I also vote. Now, how far do we extend the franchise? These are details. I mean, Hegel doesn't write about universal suffrage, for example, votes for women, but I don't think anything breaks in Hegelian system if we extend the vote to the women and to the poor. So people vote as members of corporations, again, trade unions, if you want, broadly speaking, the corporations of teachers, corporations of doctors, corporations of lawyers. And these corporations form the lower chamber of the representative assembly. So far, I feel more or less we're on the same page with Hegel. But then there's the upper chamber of the representative assembly, and this is where people are going to have problems. And I'm not saying I agree with Hegel, but he certainly has a point. He says the upper chamber is going to be made of landed aristocracy. Now, of course, to some extent, it's just a feudal vestige. Hegel is writing, I mean, Hegel is talking about a constitutional arrangement, but he is not living in a constitutional arrangement. He is living in an absolutist monarchy. The constitution was promised by the Kaiser, but it was not delivered. Sorry, it was promised by the king, but was not delivered. So this, to some extent, is, fantasy in Hegel's head. People often say that Hegel is a state worshipper of the Prussian monarchy, but you can see that, again, when he writes, this is mostly from the Rechtsphilosophy, philosophy of right, this picture, all sorts of examples, like the idea of representation, voting, did not exist in Prussia at the time. So Hegel definitely, at the very least, is a reformer. He doesn't just accept everything that he sees around him. But still, is there some kind of rational justification for having the landed aristocracy? And there is. Because Hegel is going to say, look, the market is volatile. So, get rich quick schemes, and some people go out of business. So The market is volatile, but the landed aristocracy these are people whose lives are much more stable. They're tied to the land. Their nobility title is tied to the country. They cannot just sell their land and move out, because then they will lose their aristocratic title and their ability to sit in council. As opposed to industrial magnates, as Marx is going to say, capital has no country. You get rich quick and you move to another country, you don't care about the consequences. Free rider problems. There's a certain validity to the claim that landed aristocracy would care more about the future of the country because they're tied to the land. And also because they have a stable source of income tied to the land, they can devote their lives to self-cultivation. Again, this ideal, Platonic and Aristotelian ideal of self-cultivation, free from necessity, right? And Edmund Burke has a very similar conservative justification of aristocracy. Now, I don't expect you to find this argument plausible. I don't find this argument particularly plausible. But think about this. Again, let's imagine we disagree with Hegel's conclusion. But his reasoning that the only people to whom we can trust political affairs have to have a high level of education and independence from the volatility of the market. In some sense, Marx, in his provision, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, the fact that everybody's needs are going to be met in Marxist communist society, this has a certain, how should I put this, a certain flavor similar to what Hegel is talking about here. Now, representative assembly systematizes public opinion. And Hegel says public opinion should be respected because it's the opinion of the public, but it also should be despised because people are not experts. When there's an outbreak of the pandemic, you don't go for a vote. You ask the doctors what is the right way to deal with the pandemic. So it has to be the experts who rule. But very importantly, there has to be a vote of confidence. The representative assembly gives a vote of confidence to the expert element. And these people are appointed not on the basis of elections, but on the basis of merit through examination. But again, and like if there's no confidence, if there's a vote of no confidence, then you fire the cabinet and you devise a new type of examination. You find new experts. But again, in this quasi-aristocratic fashion, the assembly chooses between different, candidates for meritocracy. This is not direct democracy, is what I'm trying to say. It's an important element of representation and indirectness. We have seen something similar in Mill. Now, on top of this entire system, we have the crown. This is a constitutional monarchical system. And some people are going to say, well, isn't this archaic? Can we, instead of the crown, have the president? Maybe, okay? Again, this is another element of Hegelian system I don't expect you to buy. But there's a certain reason, again, behind what Hegel is saying. You have a unity of the nation represented in a single individual who is a member of a single unbroken dynasty. Some meaning to that, right? And Hegel understands that the monarch is probably not going to be particularly skilled. So most of the time, what the monarch does is dots the I's and crosses the T's of legislation. Like in many constitutional regimes, like in England, for example, the Queen doesn't rule, but only reigns, right? She signs legislation which is approved by the expert cabinet. But, like in England, constitutional monarchy, the crown has veto power. So in case of emergency, so this is, ever since Plato, this is the danger, in Plato and in Rousseau, the danger that the executive branch is going to usurp the authority. And your constitutional state will degenerate into some kind of dictatorship or authoritarianism. You have double check on the power of the expert cabinet. The representative assembly gives a vote of confidence, and the crown has emergency veto powers. Now, I want to emphasize that I believe that in broad outline, this is the system which is more or less considered best by the vast majority of political philosophers or people. I mean, Marx introduces obviously some alterations to the system. We'll talk about Marx. But in essence, this notion that, again, whatever problem we face, this is the solution. I mean, you may want to get rid of the crown, and instead of the crown, you're going to have the president. You maybe want to get rid of the landed aristocracy. But in general, the general notion that the people elect representatives supervise the experts. Again, and the experts then make laws. Isn't this the solution to the riddle of history? Well, Nietzsche and Foucault are going to say maybe not. Maybe not. Okay, it's important to not jump to conclusions, resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. But I feel that this is the system that we have under scrutiny. Again, if a meteor is going to strike the Earth, if there's global climate change or an outbreak of global pandemic, isn't this the kind of system that most people have in mind in the 21st century? Again, that the experts make the decisions, but the experts are supervised. Now, another huge issue that we need to deal with this in the system is the question of international relations. Again, Hegel mostly falls within the realist tradition, and he's going to agree with Rousseau and with Hobbes that sovereignty is tied to nationhood. Nation is sovereign. In this case, the decision of the cabinet signed by the crown is supreme. This is the moment of the sovereignty, when the crown signs the cabinet legislation. And there is no higher authority. Therefore, Hegel wants to say that between the nations, the possibility of war is an irreducible reality. Like, the threat of war is an irreducible reality of international relations. Now, if you want to sit and think about this for an hour or two and imagine some kind of hypothetical scenario in which we can achieve perpetual peace, how the whole world becomes one country, maybe you can make it work. But by and large, Hegel assumes that the level of the nation state is going to be the ultimate level, and it's not going to be superseded. It's going to be a huge difference between Hegel and Marx later down the line. Marx is a cosmopolitan, Hegel is a nationalist. There is no higher court of appeal than the individual states. And states, between them, cannot have completely binding agreements, so that there's always a possibility of war. So, is Hegel a warmonger? No, I think not. He thinks that war is, first of all, inevitable. The threat of war is inevitable. It's an irreducible fact of life. It might not be nice, but it's there. It's there to stay. So, maybe I should write like war in the international relations, right? But then war also, remember, has a positive part to play. Because if the expert, and again, this kind of thought which goes back to Hobbes, that the strength of the sovereign is derived from the vigor of the subjects, and sovereigns who don't take care of their subjects are conquered by other sovereigns. Now, so Hegel has not seen the horrors of the First and the Second World War. He imagines, a short, relatively bloodless war, like, for example, the Franco-Prussian War, which happened after Hegel's death, but still. So short, limited war between combatants, right? But the idea is that war and the threat of war and the patriotic sentiment which war engenders is a necessary functional element of this picture. And Hegel probably would say that if you had one country in the entire world, in the absence of robust external challenges, you'd get, sort of free rider problems. Without the threat from the outside. And this is also a very Darwinian thought, that in-group cooperation always has to be ensured by out-group competition. So in this sense, I want to stress, I don't think that Hegel is a warmonger. I don't think he glorifies war. War is limited, and in fact, Hegel thinks that, you should only fight wars when it's necessary, and you should try to bring wars to a close as fast as possible. But wars are inevitable, and in fact, they will play a certain limited positive role, like sickness. Children, even in the 21st century, you don't expect children to never get sick. And in fact, I think the general consensus is that it's fine, okay, maybe it's even functional for children to get certain diseases. It doesn't mean that you should try to infect your children on purpose, but it will happen, and it serves a certain positive, limited role. So, as I've already mentioned several times, Hegel is a very sophisticated thinker, and it would take many lectures to discuss all the details of his philosophy. My task is mostly to try to be as clear as possible at the cost of some, occasional superficiality. But there's a very important word which is associated with Hegel. Hegel uses it widely, and it's hard to understand. The word is Geist, or spirit in German. And here's what I have to say, that you have this possibility of a I talk about left Hegelian, progressive, reformist interpretation of Hegel, and the right Hegelian, conservative interpretation of Hegel. Very often, right Hegelian interpretations are also religious interpretations. And this is where we would talk about God. Now, did Hegel believe in God? It's hard to say. I mean, in Hegel's own day, atheism was not an acceptable position in Prussia. I want to say that the most productive interpretations of Hegel in the 20th century were atheist interpretations of Hegel. So it's very possible to interpret Hegel in completely atheistic fashion. But we have to keep in mind that within Hegel's corpus, much is written about God and about religion. Let me try to scratch the surface a little bit, talking about God, and also explain how can we talk about God in a secular way for Hegel. So let's start with the simplest possible, again, secular formulation. I'm an individual. I have my spirit, my mind. And the idea is that in order for me to be properly human and properly happy, I have to be a member, and in fact, a patriot of a well-functioning society. So there's a certain important element of how, at the end of history, proper individuality is reliant upon, again, individual freedom, individual happiness relies on membership in a well-ordered society. So I have my individual spirit, which is dependent on the spirit of the nation. And, metaphysically, some people would imagine, does Germany as a whole have certain separate consciousness? And in my interpretation, the answer is no. When you think in terms of Rousseau, of the general will, the objective interest of the German nation as a whole is the spirit of German nation. But the idea is that this interest is embodied, it is instantiated in the minds of individual Germans. So a great German statesman in their own head understands the general will of the German nation. This is kind of the cash value of this idea of the spirit. Spirit of the nation embodied, instantiated in a particular individual. In fact, if you want to go slightly deeper, this is the difference between Plato and Aristotle. In the Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato, ideas exist maybe in some separate realm, in the Neoplatonic, potentially misinterpretation of Plato. But for Aristotle, ideas have to always be embodied somewhere. So in a similar fashion, kind of this Aristotelian idealism, the spirit of the German nation has to be realized, instantiated in particular minds of individual people, like great statesmen or great philosophers like Hegel. But then there's also the idea of world history. And somebody like Marx would talk about, or Kant would talk about a truly cosmopolitan position. And Hegel has none of this. For Hegel, individuals realize themselves as part of world history. You realize your world historical role only through the mediation of patriotism to a given nation. So even in a religious interpretation of Hegel, your highest duty to God is to be a good patriot of your nation. To be a good Christian is to be, first and foremost, a good German. So again, you have the individual spirit, individual Geist. This is the spirit of the nation, Volksgeist, and this is the spirit of the world, the Weltgeist. But the Weltgeist doesn't exist, the human community doesn't exist as a separate thing. The Weltgeist is like a relay race, where the relay is passed between different states, kind of the states on the cutting edge of history, kind of this progressive, romantic element in Hegel. So this is the secular interpretation of Hegel. And if you want to make it into a religious interpretation, then you say, no, actually by world history, by Weltgeist, we actually mean the mind of God. For many different reasons, I want to leave this interpretation, I want to break it out, this interpretation, but I just want you to be aware that this interpretation exists. So, talk about God. In religious interpretation, we're talking about God. In the secular interpretation, no, we're talking about the logic of human history, higher rationality, which is embedded in the quasi-Darwinian selection process of history, like historical reason. Rationality embedded in the historical process. So, talk about idealism. Again, in the religious interpretation of Hegel, we're talking about how ideals are real and effective in life. But on the secular interpretation of Hegel, on the sociological interpretation of Hegel, actually Hegel is not really very much an idealist, right? Hegel is, notion, it's not men who make history, but history makes men. It's, and again, Geist, the spirit of the nation, would be something like a sociological way of understanding culture, cultural dynamic, cultural historical dynamic, diachronic process. And in this sense, actually, I think a valid way to understand what Hegel means by idealism is almost exactly what Marx means by materialism. It's a controversial statement, but we'll talk about this. So it's like, it's not men who make history, but history makes men. There's a certain cultural dynamic. Yes, ideas emerge, ideas evolve throughout culture, and then particular individuals instantiate these ideas, and particular individuals maybe change these ideas. But at the end of the day, the individual thinks, again, language and thought is historically determined. This is like historical dialectical idealism. And a deep and problematic question is teleology. Is there a goal, an end to history? Well, I feel that Hegel himself was far too optimistic. He thought that either we have almost achieved the Rechtsstaat, this end of history, or it's right around the corner, or maybe it's inevitable, right? And so in the religious interpretation of Hegel, yes, this end of history, when events are going to continue, but by and large, we have solved the riddle of history. We have found a way to organize society in a harmonious fashion. So clocks will continue ticking, newspapers will continue to be printed, but this broad picture of the Rechtsstaat, the structure of the constitutional state will not change, right? This is, I feel, far too optimistic. A more pessimistic, a more secular reading of Hegel, like in Marx, because I'm going to insist that this productive reading of Hegel and productive reading of Marx is an anti-teleological reading. Yes, there's a process of historical selection, and so you have a certain directionality in which stronger states, stronger social systems outcompete and drive weaker social systems to extinction. So there's a certain emergent directionality. But this directionality is emergent from this contingent process. It is not necessary. And in fact, in the words of Karl Marx, the class struggle could end with the victory of the progressive class or with the common ruin of the contending classes. So kind of the immediate way in how we can secularize Hegel is, instead of, again, this God, idealism, and teleology, we could say that there's a potentiality, fighting with our blood and sweat, fighting with words, fighting with the pen, with pamphlets, but also maybe fighting in the streets and through violent revolution against French Revolution. Is the blood of the French Revolution is a necessary element for Hegel in the dialectical historical process. So basically, in this anti-teleological reading, there's a possibility of achieving this harmonious state, but it's not given. It's not given. It's a possibility, it's a potentiality. Men, like you and me, must become conscious of the historical conflict and fight this conflict out. The end of history is not given. It's not necessary. It is contingent. This is the way to secularize Hegel, and this was definitely the most, not necessarily the most accurate, but the most productive way to read Hegel. And this is basically the reading that I want to suggest to you, keeping in mind that, again, the nuances of Hegel's philosophy go deeper. So, Hegel's conservatism, right, very famously embodied in this phrase, was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich, und was wirklich ist, das ist vernünftig. What is rational becomes actual, and what is actual becomes rational. Or elsewhere, Hegel says, what is real is rational, what is rational is real. It's because of this embedded rationality in the world. So again, in the religious interpretation, it would be like a true statement of religious faith or maybe religious knowledge that the world is really a harmonious place which is evolving towards this best of possible arrangements. But a secular reading of Hegel, a much more cautious reading of Hegel and maybe progressive reading of Hegel is to see this entire picture that we have been talking about as, again, as a normative ideal. Don't call Hegel a fascist. He's not, I mean, I think it's a gross misdescription to think Hegel as of Hegel as a warmonger and as a defender of tyranny. Again, remember, freedom at the end of history is both objective, you do what is objectively good, but also is subjective. You realize your individual inclination and your own individual happiness. So, but when we talk about this normative ideal, like an etalon, right? A gold standard vis-a-vis which we can describe actually existing societies. This is exactly what Hegel is saying. Think back to Aristotle, this medical analogy. No human individual is perfectly healthy, but a vision of perfect health is useful to the doctor. And the doctor can give you recommendations based on this vision of perfect health. So in a similar fashion, Hegel actually says in the Rechtsphilosophie, in the philosophy of right, that the state as it exists in reality is never perfect, the same way in which no human being is perfectly healthy. But Hegel is going to say, even a crippled, a deformed individual is alive because of the principle of health within them, if you want. So in a similar fashion, Hegel wants to say, let's ask this question, conflict or consensus? Conflict or consensus? I think the productive way of reading Hegel is not like Hegel says, oh, it's all consensus all the time. No, Hegel gives you a vision of consensus, and he wants to say that societies that exist and that actually function to the extent that they have a consensual element within them. Think back to Plato. Plato says even a band of robbers can only be effective if there's a certain limited justice at least within them, right? So any state is alive to the extent that it instantiates this vision of harmony. But it doesn't mean that all states are perfect, right? So I suppose again so in this phrase, the real becomes rational, the rational becomes real, right? Or actual, right? Not all that exists, not everything that exists is actually actual for Hegel, right? Only those elements of society which are stable, harmonious, which will be retained in historical time, those are really actual. And the mistakes, the errors, the bribes and the corruption are transient. And it's the task of philosopher to differentiate between the two. So I suppose, again, this is, let me leave you with this. This is the challenge and the promise of Hegelian philosophy. He gives us the vision of consensus and asks us to contemplate this vision. And again, the most important divide of Hegelians after Hegel is going to be into this left and right Hegelians, right? And the right Hegelians in this maybe slightly naive and facile fashion are going to say, we already live in a perfect society. And therefore, if you have a problem with society, does not need changing. It just needs to be interpreted in the right way. And if you do not feel at home, if you feel alienated in the society in which you live, then it's your problem because the society is already perfect. This is the right Hegelian interpretation. But the left Hegelian, is going to be so much more important, and we're going to keep coming back to the Hegelian interpretation, right? No, actually, maybe if you feel alienated, it's not your problem. It is the problem that we have only reached the ideal in the realm of ideas in our head, but not in reality. And of course, we're going to talk about Marx next time. And I want you to be aware that very importantly, for both Hegel and Marx, the biggest problem is going to be the economy. So in some important sense, you could say that the reason why we were not able to realize the ideals of the French Revolution is because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is opposed to the French Revolution, right? And if we want to achieve political democracy, political equality, political emancipation, we need to first achieve economic emancipation. And again, Hegel is much more conservative in this sense. He thinks that a welfare state and regulated economy will work. But Marx, in our next lecture, is going to say, no, we need a radical transformation in order for this picture to not just be a beautiful picture, but to actually become a reality.